Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson, former fundamentalist minister who has seen the light without abandoning the baby or throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I've expanded on my worldview over the years from that basic premise of believing and trusting in the Word of God, which I have never abandoned. I'm here with Jafar Falahi, Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and fellow Baha'i, who has studied philosophy and is a regular on our show. Welcome, Jafar. And also Daniel Sanderson, who will tonight be gracing us with his presence at his last regular appearance. Daniel has been a Stammgast, a regular guest for the last several months. And we've been extremely grateful to Daniel, who is the founder and CEO of Planksip, which is a platform for disseminating philosophical knowledge, and also a philosopher and writer in his own right, pun intended. So, Daniel, welcome. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into your experiences on the show and what you've gained from it here shortly. But I would like to first just thank you from the bottom of my heart for participating in this. When I invited you, obviously you and I had known each other through different interactions and had done some things together. But I invited you specifically because of your professed agnostic stance, previously atheist, who did not accept a divine creator. And I thought, well, how interesting to have somebody like that on a show titled Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. And it has worked out extremely well. I've been so grateful for you to participate in this, even though your perspective was very different, exactly because your perspective was very different. And that's what I wanted and needed on this show in order to test and hone the coherence of my own views and, expand and learn from you as we went along. So I want to thank you and acknowledge and recognize personally what I have gained from our dialogues. So, as I mentioned or hinted at, I invited you specifically because of my belief in the power of dialogue or consultation, if you will, to use a term familiar with our Baha'i audience who's tuning in on the Clearwater Baha'i channel, in addition to those who we publicly invite on the YouTube channel. We grow and learn through dialogue with those who have different perspectives than our own. The Bible refers to this as iron sharpening iron, and there are many analogies one could use to express this basic principle. And that is one of the key premises of this show, Created in the Image of God. So I'm going to go a little bit into sort of my philosophical religious underpinning of that comment and further express gratitude to you, Daniel, for having delivered that here on this show. So, God is, as far as we are concerned, infinite. He has created a potentially infinite number of instances of himself. Now, that may seem audacious and blasphemous, but consider the title of this show, Created in the Image of God. What does that mean, in the image of God? To what degree does that extend? Sometimes it's referred to as the express image of God, God expressing himself. God himself reveals that we are created in his image. So if you accept that there's a creator God, that's what he says. So I don't know why one would consider it blasphemous to repeat his words. He then differentiated that not only in that first instance, Adam, but also in Eve. As he said, he created them in his image, male and female created he them. So further differentiating himself into a male and a female of the human species, both created in the image of God. And then, of course, there are an infinite or a potentially infinite number of variations of both the man and the woman. So now you've got 2 times infinity, right? Potentially, theoretically, mathematically, each one being unique, and they can multiply and multiply and multiply on into infinity, unless, of course, we wipe ourselves out first. And he, in fact, commanded us to be fruitful and multiply. I personally believe that there's a reason for that. Now, we'll get into that theologically here from the book of John, chapter 4. It is my personal belief that as God invites us to seek to know him, we can best achieve that by knowing each other. And I'm going to substantiate this with verses directly from John, one of Jesus' disciples, in case any doubt that this is true doctrinally. So let me quote from John chapter 4. First of all, let me say that the preface to John chapter 4 is introducing and expressing who Jesus Christ is or was. That's not the point of what I'm saying now. Don't think that I believe that's not important. I would just invite anyone to read the whole chapter on their own. I'm going to skip over the interspersed verses that refer to Christ and only specifically talk about this one major thread. So he says in verse 6, John says, "We are of God. He who knows God hears us. He who is not of God does not hear us." Actually, this is not one of the verses I even wanted to read. It's fine. Verse 7 gets into this main thread. "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." Let me repeat that. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. That's the context of that famous statement, God is love. So skipping forward to verse 12, no one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us. And the key point of this thread, and the main point I'm making here, if someone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a liar. John says, you're a liar if you say you know God and have hate in your heart. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? Powerful words. My point, I mean, we could spend the entire show on this. My point is, God has created us in his image. He has given us the capacity to love in the essence of who and what we are, and to have God in us and to know who God is through that expression of love. And in all these instances of our brother, we can come to know God better as we express love to our brothers and sisters whom we can see, whom we can interact with. And for those who have a different perspective than us, the opportunity to know God increases exponentially as we learn to love those whose viewpoints are different from ours. So this loving dialogue we've been having, and it really has been, in my view, about goodness, as Daniel has expressed it, and about God, has led to additional insights for me. And Daniel, you've expressed some for you as well, which we'll get to in a minute. I'm just going to share that regular viewers should know that some of the insights that I've shared on this show have flowed directly from the dialogue on this show, from exploring these topics and issues with those who think differently. And of course, those who also think, basically the same, but are still have a unique, individualized perspective. Those who are not following some kind of religious dogma, but rather who are independently investigating the reality of God through their experiences in this world and their experiences with their fellow human beings, with their brothers and sisters, and again, especially those who think differently. There's been an amazing growth in my understanding of specifically how God is pursuing his goal with humanity across people of different perspectives and independently of whether they specifically want to relate to him or not, as we've discussed in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that has flowed out of this concept of love and protection towards our fellow human beings. We've also looked at the framework of human experience essentially since the Enlightenment and the development of America and the Declaration of Independence, and how it flowed into that Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we'll continue to go down that path and talk about rights and responsibilities as we differentiate and invite some very interesting women on the show. Because, Daniel, the only possibility of replacing you would be to replace you with a woman. No man could fill your seat. So we're looking forward to that, and the viewers should look forward to that in upcoming episodes. But Daniel, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into your personal experience, as this is your last regular experience and appearance, and unpack where we're at and coming to understand on this frontier of learning from your perspective. So perhaps if you could elaborate on the thoughts you shared in your newsletter earlier today from Planksip, and how your worldview might have changed over the last several months. For example, you wrote, when I relinquished this desire that you describe in the newsletter of trying to convince someone of my understanding, I felt a peaceful feeling rush over me. I came to this conclusion on my own. Perhaps it should stay with me, or perhaps there are better things to focus my attention on. Do you want to maybe unpack that a little bit from our audience, how you got there and what that was like and what might be changing as you sit with that, peaceful feeling of not having to maybe convince somebody else of the way you see things?
Yeah. The peaceful feeling is something that maybe I could describe as wisdom in action with an upgrade to emotion. It's something that feels more felt as an experience as opposed to maybe purely intellectualized or rationalized. I mean, self-professed, I spend a lot of time in ancient Greek literature, and although they do focus on a holistic, balanced being in the world, I don't know if we as a society actually view and experience philosophy, argumentation, dialogue in that kind of way. I think that the massive project which I undertook probably close to a decade ago, getting involved with a wider spectrum of learning, and this would have been outside of a business mindset, I would say. I think that that's very novel and exciting to think that you could be the shepherd of something new. And I think maybe it's just about time that I did a little bit of self-reflection and think, well, that's a massive undertaking. And I think there's a natural reflective quality inside of groups that if you're listening to the people around you, they can tell you what, not tell you, you can get this emotional feedback, this resonance that they may not even be aware of. It just happens in groups, happens in large groups and small groups. And then I started to think about, from a contemporary standpoint, how ferocious the field of philosophy can actually be. If I'm a philosopher and somebody that values wisdom, and then I look at the the most famous philosophers of our time, we could go down the list and look at the father of modern philosophy, which would be Rene Descartes, and we can look at Immanuel Kant, Nietzsche, Spinoza. We can go back to the ancient times and look at the Stoics. We can look at Epicurus. We can look at Plato and Socrates. And we can look at all these people. The moderns seem to have this unique quality of being very alienated and almost an insistency of being an island and a man to themselves. They're not really social beings. Schopenhauer, who I love his writings, was a very troubled mind and thinker. And so I guess at the end of the day, I think the realization is that friendship, love, a felt experience of joy and enjoying a space with people, creating, I think that's the better half of existence that we may be overlooking. And I think that that's an expansion or an upgrade on this pursuit of wisdom, I think. And it's missing that ingredient, at least articulated on this idea of love. And if God is love, bringing it back to your point, Wade, I think that that is the single most noticeable, upgradable differences that I've been able to glean from a tradition of Christianity from the Greeks, is to value it as a virtue. So that's what I would say.
What's interesting, I'm going to just tangent off on one little piece. My own journey, as outlined in my first book in my trilogy, The People of the Sign, ended with the shattered hopes and dreams of a global denomination when we experienced a big schism and it split right down the middle over doctrinal differences. And we had this amazing unity and this warmth and this love, which really kind of saved me as a child. And now, and I was in this divorce where I was actually kidnapped by my father and smuggled out of the country to Sweden, separated from both parents for 2 years, all this drama and trauma, and then found peace, hope, love, comfort in this religious group that then experienced the same thing at scale, in which it split right down the middle and all the kids had to either go with mom or dad, right? And suddenly your friends and your brothers and sisters were in a different group than you, and it just ripped right down the middle. And then these groups continued to further splinter. And that's when I came to realize that who we were so certain that we were fulfilling the sign, as I call it, the sign of the Christian covenant, with it, which is John. Now I'm having a brain freeze on the actual verse, John 14:33, or somebody can find the reference. But John 15. Anyway, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. And we no longer had that sign because we were a bickering, squabbling, group that now believed that our former believers were heretics, right? And so, my point is that this thing you brought out about wanting others to see it, right? Wanting to convince others of the rightness of your position, if you will. And in this case, on picky doctrinal points. I mean, don't get me wrong, and the people that were in that group, they know these were major differences. There was some major, but take a step back, take a step back, take a step back. Really, is this worth, destroying your participation in the covenant sign of Jesus Christ? No. So somehow get it together, somehow figure it out, right? To look through all that and to focus then on that thing that you're talking about, which is that communion, right? Religious people, they want to take communion. Well, how is your communion with your brothers and sisters, right? Are you loving those whom you see? And that experience that you're describing, um, that's kind of what I was taking away from it as you were speaking. I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, partially. I mean, I think that's that's very accurate, and it translates and ripples into other aspects of your relationships, your personal relationships, your friendships, your family relationships. Like you only have a capacity and an attention span to focus on. Well, I mean, like how many simultaneous thoughts can you actually suspend as we move through time? Right. And so they have implications, and what you think about and how you think, and with what emotional valence. This is a term that Damasio uses when describing felt experience and how we emote. And then maybe switching all the way over to the to something that a religious group might understand. The power of God and loving and goodness is within you. So how much of it is a matter of choice to choose what you think about and how you think about it and in the way you think about it. And then how far away am I from faith at that point? I'm not saying it's a leap, but I think it's a lot closer than we can imagine.
I'd like to continue on that theme of, the freedom that you felt of not having maybe to convince somebody else, right? And I want to share a story. When I was a minister in Germany, and there was a young man who came to our denomination, and we were non-proselytizing. We did not believe it was our responsibility to convince anybody else or to even, to teach anybody else, but rather that God would draw someone to us if they were interested in learning, perhaps by our example, right? I often have said, Jesus said you should be the light of the world, not the loudspeaker of the world, right? The best sermon is a good example. And this young man came from a denomination that believed they had a fervent responsibility to preach Christ to everyone, and that if they failed to do so, then there was, some kind of divine punishment or wrath or problem, spiritually, severely. And he shared with me that he used to sit on the metro there as he would ride around in near Stuttgart, and he was actually at the University of Tübingen, and studied theology at one of the great centers there. And he said he used to break out into a sweat when he'd sit on the metro and somebody would sit next to him, because he knew that before that ride was over, he had to preach Christ to that person. And that, in Germany, secularized modern Germany, 49 out of 50 times that person would, tell him where to get off the train. And so he then, began to experience a certain freedom in coming to an awareness that it was not his responsibility. Now, in the Baha'i faith, there's this quote. It's the second hidden word of Baha'u'llah in Arabic, Baha'u'llah being the founder of the Baha'i faith. And I'd just like to read it here in this context, and I'll post a portion of it in the chat. O son of spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if you desire me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Then he says, ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. And I have pondered that, and I'll share one thought here in a moment. But to finish it, he says, "Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes." Well, in reflecting and pondering on this verse, how it behooves me to be, I've often asked myself, well, then why am I trying to convince anyone to see things the way I see them? Why, if justice is to see it through your own eyes, well, that applies also to the other person, right? Justice is letting them see it through their own eyes. So why am I trying at all to convince them to see it through my eyes? This, this removes the responsibility of debate and proving that one is right. And it opens up the possibility of discussion and understanding something from the way the other person sees it without having to see it their way or having to have them see it my way, but having both of us reach an improved version of what we see through our own eyes. But we continue to see through our own eyes. We should never sort of seek to transplant our eyes into somebody else's head and make them see it our way, whether it's in a personal relationship with one other human being, and certainly not at scale where we have the media these days really hammering on people to try to get them to see things one way. They're not reporting objectively on the facts. Every word is carefully chosen to create a certain understanding rather than just to share information and allow people to come to their own conclusion. Every word has a spin on it, right? There's quantum entanglement going on between the agenda of the messenger and the message that gets created because it has a correlated spin. So anyway, Daniel, thank you for sharing that. What else would you like to share with the audience and or just Jafar and myself about your journey on this show and any conclusions or growth that you've experienced as you've participated?
Well, I mean, Jafar, how are you doing since the last time we got a chance to speak?
Um, I mean, I'm still curious a bit about exactly how you feel. Like I don't quite understand based off what you said, where you're at or where you were and where you've come to at this point. If it's is it just that you feel like you don't need to argue anymore, or is it that you actually feel like there's something out there that you didn't think was there before, or is it your relationship with people? I don't feel like I quite understand.
Right, right. No, I mean, I'm definitely not in a position where I think there's something that's out there that wasn't before. I think I'm still very metaphorical on the concept of God, but there is, a feeling of of a of a human spirit I can relate with, and I think there's a certain resonance that is beneficial um, for 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 humans to tap into, something that we can't quite reason, and that we have to just experience. And I think that's what's codified in the Word of God. And I think um, approaching it through the heuristics that were laid down by our forefathers and philosophers and thinkers and thought leaders before us, before this technology, I think provided a very valuable insight into um, into the human species and what it means to be human. And I wouldn't say that it's even as crystallized as Wade describes his worldview, right? I mean, I'm happy to leave it in a a little bit of a fuzzy form. And I don't even know if agnostic is the right category. I feel like I don't want to be labeled anything, really. I feel that it's just something that I have a feeling of greater understanding, and that understanding is it has that understanding has a lot of compassion and for another human being trying to do exactly what we are, I guess, our innate human nature to belong and to, want to be part of something bigger and greater. And I think that that religions and the role of religion, offers that operating system. And to our peril, if we try and reconstruct these systems, this it could be devastating. And yeah,
I mean, I said a few episodes ago that I honestly don't know what exactly I mean when I say I believe in God, or even as a Baha'i, the Baha'i faith talks about the inability of the human mind or to understand what God is, and that speaking about what God is actually blasphemy in a sense. So, but what Wade said, combining kind of what Wade said with what you're saying, makes some sense to me, because it's sort of an attitude that you have with another person, as being sort of a created. It brings you close to a person, and for me, when there's this relationship of, hey, let's go explore the universe together, rather than let's debate about what the nature of existence is, and draw lines and take sides. Like it's a whole different world of consciousness, the two things, and the one in which people are kind of cooperating to explore the universe together as equals created in the image of God, compared to a bunch of contending factions that are competing over a slice of the pie, which is oftentimes how I feel the world is now. That to me is what kind of excites me, the potential for the former rather than the latter.
yeah.
Well, Daniel, when you said you'd prefer not to have any label applied, I was about to say, well, what about seeker of truth? And then you mentioned the word understanding, and I thought, well, what about seeker of understanding? And then I thought, well, because I'm a word geek, so I went and quickly looked up the etymology of understanding. Standing under what, right? And it is, in fact, from the Old English, meaning comprehension, but also mutual agreement. And they go back to 1803 and the use of the word to stand under, but it isn't the usual wording meaning beneath, but rather among, right? To stand among, to understand. So it gets right at the heart and core of what we're talking about here. Understanding is to reach agreement. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another word, hermeneutics, which applies it to more of a textual tradition. And I remember I was working on a something called a hermeneutic meme, and I think it's the idea of a meme as a replicatable unit of like Richard Dawkins talks about, like the replicating meme as it transfers through societies, right? And to understand that is different than describing it, like, from a clinical standpoint, or saying this is how a virus functions, right? Like, experiencing it is a little bit different, and understanding the experience that you're actually going through, the way we understand time and experience relationships and love and project ourselves into the future and recall and remember the past. There's whole dimensions to that I haven't even crossed the line, and like I'm still completely secular in these comments, right? And I think that starts to lay the groundwork where I can meet Jafar and Wade, and I can have this conversation, and I can stay away from the conversations of drawing lines in the sand and saying, well, how can you believe in a guy that's floating up in the sky with a beard and all this kind of crap? Like, it's just so infantile that
It really is, right? So I want to provide a quote here from Rebecca Goldstein, a philosopher. I've been watching this Netflix thing on infinity, and it's interviewing a number of people, and I haven't watched the end of it. I don't know where it's going to go, but so far it's strictly secular, mathematical. But the awe and wonder of just the mathematical concept of infinity and what it means and how it's dealt with. And she said, Rebecca Goldstein, one of the things that she loves about thinking about infinity is that feeling that I'm bigger because I know how small I am. And Jafar, as you were talking, I thought of this quote, that feeling that I'm bigger because I know how small I am. It's an interesting inversion there.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I don't know if the listeners know, but Rebecca Goldstein is Steven Pinker's wife, and related to that entire circle of friends with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and this type of thing, right? Part of that. I don't know if he's part of the New Atheists or anything, but he's part of that, at least once removed, part of that circle. And I think he has, publicly said that he believes in a Spinoza type of God. He's a non-practicing Jew, culturally experiencing Jew. And what does that mean? Well, he's like, he enjoys the traditions and the heritage and the culture, but doesn't buy into the metaphysical claims that contradict what we know with science. And so I would say the idea of infinity is really interesting. And if that fills somebody with awe and wonder, I think, okay, well, that's interesting, but an awe and wonder that was actually filled with something bigger, but then also filled with an abundance of love and happiness and joy. Infinity can't do that, right? Or at least our mathematical understanding of infinity isn't filled with that very human part of the world. And so to me, there's an aspect that seems richer and potentially more valuable to understand that there's I don't know. I can't make the claim that there's a universal love and acceptance in the world, because this, we get into arguments of why is there evil in the world, right?
Well, there's not. I don't think you can, and I don't believe there is. I don't believe it is universal,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think we have clear evidence that there is not universal love, acceptance, whatever. There's differentiation.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, one of the beautiful things I think about the human species is that we have the ability, this is very Platonic, is that you can say, well, what is this perfected ideal of, I could say goodness, just to bring the point and make my point a little bit more clear. You're impregnating an ethical claim into your outlook. And you're describing something about the human species that is moving towards a cooperation of a eusocial species. And you're thinking, wow, that's really interesting that there's malicious intent, there's backstabbing and theft and terrible things that happen. But there's also the the progression that happens through human evolution is something that moves forward from ditch to ditch, to use an analogy that you've kind of popularized a little bit. But that road, that gravel road, is actually paved with a benevolent eusocial trajectory, if that makes sense at all. I mean, I'm really kind of putting a metaphor on there, but
well, and if you're going to quote me, you have to use the color that I like to throw at it. We lurch forward from ditch to ditch.
We lurch, yeah. Yeah, so there's so then do you think that there's like a horse and a wagon, how you get that like pulling and that snapping effect?
Once you're in a ditch, you don't just simply move out of it.
Right, you're thrown in or yanked out, or you're
exactly. It takes some energy to get yourself out of that ditch, and that energy often carries you across the road into the other one.
Yeah.
So getting back to this topic of infinity, though, I want to share another thought, and that is that another person. I took some notes here. There was a physicist, and I don't think I noted which physicist it was. It was a theoretical physicist who said that mathematical continuums do not exist in the real world. So as these mathematicians work with the concept of infinity and show how you can use the concept of infinity to actually solve problems, and the example that he uses now to make his point is, mathematicians like to say things like, well, you can cut a line in half and in half again and in half again, and you can do this infinitely and you still have a line. He says it's actually not true at all in the real world. He says that take any substance, and he uses a rope, keep cutting it in half, and at some point you no longer end up with that substance at all in the real world. So he then says infinity does not actually exist in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a concept that is denied in the real world. And of course, for me, I find this fascinating, because if we were to try to do what Einstein did with E equals mc squared, right? Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. It's fascinating that Einstein, it boggles the mind that he could pull this off with such an equation and have it be accurate, actually mathematically accurate. It's not like, some variation that approximates the speed of light. No, it's exactly the speed of light, right? And again, I don't know how mathematicians do their magic. Sometimes I think it's sleight of hand, but I trust that they do know what they're doing. But my point is, this concept of infinity apparently doesn't really exist in the world. And that, if you want to, but you could then use infinity to represent God in an equation, and mathematically you would then prove that God exists, but in the real world, he actually doesn't exist, right? According to the theoretical physicist. And so you have this divide. And I thought, well, nothing in the real world actually represents infinity. And you could invert that and say infinity actually represents nothing. Right? So it's interesting in this physical world to try to get somebody else to see through your eyes what you see and what you experience is truly pointless at that level. And it's my perspective, just to help somebody understand where I'm coming from, that the being who created all there is exists obviously outside of it, having created it. And the system is created such that the signature, the fingerprints are there, but you can't actually match those fingerprints to anything, if you will.
Right.
Because you don't have access to the finger, which made that fingerprint.
Well, this is the whole that was the Zeno's paradox, right? And it's common sense. I mean, even Aristotle couldn't, didn't even really give it much thought. It's like, it's obvious, I mean, point well made about, cutting things in half and in half and in half and in half. But, and it's a fun problem to think about. But I'm going to maybe spend a little bit of time in Infinity, and there's lots of YouTube videos out there about this that are helpful for the readers or listeners and viewers. I think one of the things that is helpful is that if you look at the total size of the known universe, it still doesn't even come close. I mean, you'd say close to infinity. It's not even it's not even a Google. It's not even the size of a. I don't even know how to explain that, but it's like
it's finite.
Yeah, it's finite. Yes, and even on the large scale, and then also on the small scale. So on the small scale, we're even theoretically we're only a Planck length is theoretically the smallest unit, and then at that point, space and time, the meaning of it changes. It the whole mathematics crumbles. Now, I mean, you can take this in another perspective and say, well, I mean, someone could say, aha, that's where God lives. If we blast through there, he'll be on either side of something that we just can't even comprehend. And these are the boundary conditions of God's playground. But I mean, I don't know. This almost seems like a contemporary perversion of sorts anyways. Like I understand in history, most recent history, we would uncover things as explorers and challenge the church in ways that really upset our cosmology, right? And this kind of feels like the scientific community going, aha, we're almost there. It's just like there's only this tiny little bit that we keep proving those religious folk wrong and wrong and wrong, and eventually we're just going to completely wipe this idea of God off the map. But it seems like the wrong conversation to have. I think there was a period of time when religious ideology and I guess culture had a very oppressive feeling to the way people lived, and the dominating culture is no longer entirely dictated by religious thought, and so science had a different role at that. It had a freeing factor to it. And now science is at a different level. And so it gets this inertia or mass to itself that.
Are you saying we're moving from one ditch to the other? And interestingly, we've talked a lot on this show about coercion, right? So it's interesting to me that religion has, so often become very coercive, right? And isn't that some of what gave the energy to science, right? Of proving the church wrong, the Copernican revolution, right? And Galileo and that. But my point is, the religious texts themselves are, in my opinion, non-coercive, right? And I know you could point to examples or instances of religion that was coercive, but even the texts of those religions, I mean, the creation story and Genesis, God sets forth two choices, and he educates and advises about which choice he feels is better, but then he lets his creation make their own choice. And it's basically, well, you made your bed, you're going to sleep in it kind of approach. It's very laissez-faire. And that principle of freedom of choice is enshrined throughout. It, despite what some would claim, I challenge anyone to show me in the Bible where that freedom of choice is ever removed. I don't believe you can show me from the Bible where that freedom of choice is ever removed, where God ever performs some kind of lobotomy or puts us in some kind of straitjacket. And yet, throughout history, we have been coercive to each other. I mean, going back to Genesis, the very first example is this, battle between Cain and Abel, in which one of them kills the other.
I mean, a secular argument would say that we have more outcomes of or tendencies towards coercive tendencies when implementing ideological frameworks or religious dogmas. And
right,
so,
but what we find, not to interrupt, but what we find is that when, in the absence of religion, some other ideology takes over.
right. Yeah, one that it's well, then there's that it's better the devil you know and then the one you don't. So we've had 2,000 years of describing what the devil is. It's better to get to use that framework rather than get hit by something that you don't know.
Well, we
And
do know. I mean, experiments were performed in the 19th and 20th century that were horrific and could be easily compared to the worst of what occurred in the guise of religion.
yeah, but there's two sides of the coin on that one that says that was religiously motivated, or I don't know. I don't know if the jury's out on that a little bit, right? I mean, you're talking about the framework of communism and fascism, and I just don't know if the two are directly correlated to say, well, that's because we've stopped believing. I don't know. I don't buy that.
Well, I would think you could easily make the case that in communism, for example, the teachings of Karl Marx, as and I get that this is one soundbite and a caricature, but religion being the opiate of the people, and establishing a state that sought to eradicate religion, and then you have other instances of that in other countries as well. I'm not talking so much about fascism, because definitely Hitler had serious religious overtones and incorporated religion into his thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with that. I mean, but even in Russia, and I don't know the history of this, but I mean, that's where the orthodoxy still exists and thrives. That Greek orthodoxy exists in in Eastern in Eastern Europe, right? You've been there, right? I
Well, I
mean,
think the more you try to stamp something out, the more
right,
it's going to fight to survive.
right,
And
exactly. And I
it
think
almost like keeps it alive when you try to oppress it.
yeah, what is a lot of the notable, even on a secular side, from a scholarly and academic perspective, the rulers and the time periods where there was more acceptance from rulers and less persecution, more religious freedom, more toleration. It seemed that there was better outcomes for humanity and populations, right? So we
Absolutely.
learn that you need to accept and
Right.
allow people to um, yeah, practice their own, and their own faiths or lack of, right? I mean, yeah.
Jafar, any notes of wisdom here to add?
Nope.
Well, Jafar, have you been in like a Baha'i for most of your life?
Yeah, my parents are. I was raised by.
And not the kind of Baha'i that Wade's gets all up and antsy about, but okay, I get
I, yeah, I think I'm a little different. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're all different, but I definitely, when I was young, um, kind of attached myself to scripture, but then also realized that um, I really, I realized that I had to confront the rest of the world, and I couldn't just hide in my religious shell. So I struggled for a long time trying to reconcile the fact that the rest of the world thought I would just didn't believe this stuff, and I did. I think a lot of people go into this sort of shell where they kind of, I don't know, Wade, you can probably describe this better, but you don't struggle with that, right? In a serious way. But I definitely struggled with it, and I still struggle with it in a very serious way. So I think that might make me a slightly different.
What specifically do you mean that you're struggling with?
I mean, I relate to Daniel. I relate to very well people who don't like religion and who don't, particularly that don't like religion. I relate very well to them, and I struggle with reconciling the religious believer with those who just don't care. Not even a philosophical way, but sort of in a human way. Um, and so it's easy. I think it's easy to be part of a religion and just think that everybody else is sort of, they don't know, and I'm not better than them, but if they had the thing I had, then they would be better off, and I have a difficult time doing that, and I can't seal myself off from that tension. I guess it's just always there, and I think it makes me. I don't doubt my religion and God in many ways, but in other ways it feels like I'm constantly doubting it, or maybe it's myself that I'm doubting. So
Well, so to address very briefly this idea of perhaps certain Baha'is making me antsy, um, the Universal House of Justice is the supreme body of the Baha'i faith, right? It is the organizing body, the governing body. It's comprised of 9 members who consult. Their authority is prescribed very specifically um, as to what it is and what it isn't, and how they go about managing the affairs of the Baha'i community globally. And they wrote a letter in 2002 addressed to the world's religious leaders. And at that time, ostensibly, I was a religious leader. I was just coming off of having been um, temporarily at the end of this, right as this schism was happening. I was the acting director of family ministries globally for our denomination. And I had lived and worked in multiple countries and preached at large assemblies in a number of different countries and different languages. And I was well respected. And one side of the faction was trying to convince me to stay with them as I was this acting director of family ministries globally. So ostensibly, I was a religious leader. And so I kind of took it to heart that this letter was actually addressed to me, even though I didn't read it at the time. In fact, I didn't even see or know of this letter's existence until, almost 20 years later, maybe 19 years later. And I read this letter, and it described 4 of the basic tenets of the Baha'i faith, which is the equality of men and women, the um, I'll call it, just, I'm not formulating it correctly, but resistance to nationalism. Right? We are citizens of the world, not only citizens of one country. Or let him who takes pride not take pride in being a citizen of his country, but in being a citizen of the world. In other words, thinking globally, thinking of mankind as one, the oneness of humanity as a whole. And thirdly, um, being without prejudice, specifically racial prejudice, right? And in this letter, the Universal House of Justice says a threshold had been reached on these 3 teachings, which were expressed by the founder of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah, beginning in 1863 from the heart of Iran, which was not necessarily a model citizen in terms of those 3 um, truths of the oneness of mankind, equality of the sexes, and not being biased about one race or the other. And but they said the fourth tenet, which is the oneness of religion, that all religion essentially comes from God, and that it has a commonality. It said on this point, the world has failed to make progress and reach a threshold of improvement. And it gave two reasons for it. And it said the reason is a lack of intellectual coherence and spiritual commitment to this principle. And so I've analyzed why that is, and having read it just a couple of years ago for the first time, it helped me filter what my experience had been, and that is that you can say that all the religions are one, but if you believe that your religion is better, you are what used to be known as a hypocrite. You're not really practicing what you preach. You're not really exemplifying the teaching of your own faith. But this is very hard to identify if one is clear and professes, well, no, I accept all the religions, and I believe in them all, and I love all the people of all religions, and you sincerely mean that and believe that you believe it. But if in your own mind and your own practice you give your own religion a superior edge, you follow me? And that's so subtle. And it can become pervasive in a group because it's so subtle. And the group can behave in that manner without realizing that it's behaving in that manner. And so you might develop a certain odor, let's say, that your nose has become acquainted with. We have cats, and we try to keep those kitty litter boxes really clean because you know what it's like if you walk into a house where they're not aware of that, right? And you immediately say, oh, you have cats, right? Or dogs, or whatever it is that you smell in that house. Everybody else can smell it, but you can't. And so keeping this perspective of being an outsider to a degree helps you be more aware of, what the ambiance of your own home. And there's this interesting analogy in the Baha'i faith of diffusing the fragrance, right? Or what I talked about earlier, be the light of the world, not the loudspeaker of the world. Let your example shine. And I was just sensitive and aware that, look, if you claim that all the religions are equal, then why do you want me to become a Baha'i at all? And the truth is, we really shouldn't. We should seek commonality and dialogue and look at everybody as our brother and work more on trying to see things through their eyes and helping, have that two-way dialogue. So it's that makes me nervous, because I'm like, hey, we need to clean this house up a little bit because everyone else kind of sees this and we don't. That's what makes me antsy in a nutshell, or that's one of the things. And I don't know what else to say that, but when if you're the one that thinks the kitty litter boxes need daily attention and everybody else says, no, it's good once every 2 weeks, it's a challenge.
That's Wade. And I think that's what I was getting at with my comments right before.
I'm happy. I was hoping that was, because it sounded like Wade got what Jafar was trying to say. I'm happy that because that made sense. See, there we have a three-way connection of understanding.
Well, but it is to create this intellectual coherence. What does that really look like, right? And in order to do so, you have to dig into the writings and understand what they actually say, right? And help a Christian understand, well, the Bible may not actually say that thing that your church taught, or a Muslim. Well, it could be understood this way, but what did Muhammad actually say? Or a Baha'i, what did Baha'u'llah really say there? We may have, come to a common, understanding, but let's go back and look at the text again. And let's look at it also in the light of these other religions that we say are all one, because that may shed some light on how we're misunderstanding our own.
Well, is it possible that well, I guess it would be. There's aspects of the Baha'i faith where you could say, this is incorrect, or it's probably the nature
Never,
of.
Daniel, never. Let me put it this way:
Okay.
there are aspects of our understanding of it,
Right. Okay.
right? So for my Baha'i friends, I gave a presentation, a workshop at this conference. There's this book called Some Answered Questions by Abdul Baha, and it's really wonderful. It's a wonderful book, and I encourage anyone who wants to know a little bit about the Baha'i faith because it's topical. It addresses all these different topics, and a new translation was issued of this book. And so I took one verse and in this workshop, I said, here's what it used to say, and here's what it says now. What's different? Why are these words different? And it's interesting because the particular verse I chose was one that was written about something that in the real world had now changed. And in light of what had occurred in the real world, one would naturally look at the prior one and say, is that entirely accurate? And what they did was they went back to the original texts, which were, I believe, in Arabic or whatever. And they modified a couple of words to more accurately reflect the reality of what we saw. Now, that might seem like proof texting your holy writings against, changing reality. But what was to me very evident and fascinating is that the translator understood it one way whenever it was translated, and 50 or 70 years later, reality showed that no, what Abdul Baha actually meant was this, and it's clear now. It's very clear now. So it wasn't that the Baha'i faith had it wrong, but it was that the understanding and the translation which got into print was wrong. And this is the issue in every religion and in every tradition that's handed down, right? And as we explore and learn and grow, we can understand it better. We don't have to, though, declare it's wrong and somehow blame God.
Yeah. No. And
Or
I
throw
think that.
God out because he obviously, well, if he couldn't, get the translation right the first time, then he's not omnipotent or omniscient.
Yeah, I think science is also. I mean, that's one of the. It's a living text, right? It's a living process. Science is a living process that gets revised. One of the projects that I was working on was to bring things back to a mathematical point, literally.
Pun
Is
intended.
Well, you'll see. Yeah, and I'll elaborate on this. So in Euclid's Elements, if you notice that everything begins with a point, it's an undefined term. It's
Interesting.
breathless. And so when you start with your axioms to say that, and think about it, the Roman numerals weren't invented until Roman times, and our algebra that we use wasn't how people did math. It was with shapes. It was with circles and triangles and lines and points. And conceptually, a point would be imagined as something that was a starting point. The point.
Anyway, go ahead. Sorry. Are you familiar with this?
No.
An absolute gem, narrated by Ringo Starr. Harry Nilsson wrote the songs. Anyway, go ahead.
So what I came up with was that the point has a duality to it, and the not the circumference, but the width of the point of the sphere, right? Is basically the diameter is, and it was pure conjecture. I said, well, as a starting point, why not come up with a fundamental theoretical measurement of the universe, which would be a Planck length? And so I've imagined and conceptualized this idea of the quantum world as two infinitesimals coming together to a point. And so I don't fall into a trap of simultaneously a wave and a particle, this duality kind of thinking. And it's conceptually very difficult to convince people of, right? It just like, again, there's this, I don't care, and I don't want to convince anybody of it. I came up with
but
it.
wait, so you're literally saying that a point has a circumference? Did I hear you correctly?
That the point,
Because if it does, then mathematically it is infinite.
oh, I see, with the circle being
Right.
infinite. Now that's not quite what I was saying. I was saying that when you look at Euclid's elements and he's describing the point, this is the axiom. This is your foundational starting point, right?
Right.
Literally. And I'm saying, and I've imagined and described the point with certain characteristics, so that if you were to draw a piece of, like, a point on a piece of paper, right? And this would be all of your starting points for a triangle, or the beginning of a line, or the beginning of all of geometry, right? A Euclidean geometry. So what I'm saying is that impregnated into that point that you put in the sand or on a piece of paper, there's a characteristic of duality to it, like two infinitesimals coming together. And that coming together is what actually forms the point, right? And the duality of the up and the down that we notice in the quantum world, I'm saying these are the fundamental constituents of a mathematics that would be one level of understanding, or one level of mathematics that we've kind of overlooked. And but in true mathematical and scientific rigor, it does not negate anything that follows it. It just means that there's a deeper level of mathematical truth that has yet to be revealed, right? Another way to look at this is something that Einstein did discover, and this was the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? That was scientific dogma until we found that the shortest distance between 2 points was a geodesic. And so it changes.
Right.
What is that has me imagine this in a way that is probably beyond my capability right now, to describe and mathematically prove. I probably could if I tried to concentrate on it and went back to school and right. But it's, it's a massive endeavor. I know that there was as the story goes, there was someone who was following a similar trajectory to the discoveries that Einstein was working on. A teacher that just didn't have enough of the mental capability to kind of pull it all together into a coherent, provable, falsifiable, to use a Popperian term. They didn't have the ability to do that. So listening and comprehension didn't come into existence into the world until that mathematical proof was actually valid. And you just kind of think about it, like how many ideas are surfacing or bubbling up that will change our complete understanding of the universe. And I'm not saying it's a huge jump to say, hey, we're getting into metaphysical claims of proving the existence of God. That's not where I'm going with it. I'm saying just natural, like discoveries of mathematics, or scientific discoveries. There was a one of my favorite thinkers, an evangelical participant. I don't know the depth of his faith, but was E.O. Wilson, and he's to me an amazing and underappreciated scholar. Passed away a couple of years ago, but his work, along with Charles Lumsden on cultural evolution, sociobiology, which, by the way, took a lot of heat from the inclusivity crowds, I guess. But his approach is divine to me, and science is divine to me. These are truths about the world that, for me, is beautiful. And until that language comes together and beauty is recognized in a broader spectrum, will simultaneously, the religious crowds will not appreciate the beauty in science or in the humanities, because they're belonging to what Jafar said, that club. And look, the Ionian enchantment is still something that, the scientific crowd says, yeah, the religious folks are kind of half stupid. I mean, when they grow a brain, then they'll realize that, this is infinitesimal and this is a part of our society that we're going to grow away from. And there's this like arrogance in these groups. And something about beauty itself, or finding the beauty in something, means that it should be a democratizing force. It should be like, yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, it's to me that is definitely a part of it. This part which you're expressing around beauty and whatnot. But pride comes before a fall, and that applies universally, in my opinion, whether you're a religious believer or whether you're a scientist. But they say that to err is human. To really screw things up, you need a computer, right? So, my fear, that's an old dad joke, right? But my fear is that the pride that is going along with the non-religious movement, emboldened by technology and science and discoveries, will be all the worse, right? Will be all the worse than the fall that has repeatedly come with every religion and with every set of beliefs, right? Pride always comes before a fall. But to your point about arrogance, the massive global pride that exists today of people who have forgotten what Goldstein said about the beauty of recognizing how small you are by acknowledging something that's so much bigger. And yes, they can recognize that the universe is vast, et cetera, et cetera. But these mathematicians and other scientists also recognize that something exists when you can create rules to manage it. Right. That was another thing I got out of his theory. Let me actually find it and quote it here. And this might be a good sort of ending point. We're really trying to keep this closer to an hour and further away from 2 hours as a show. But the quote is, by Moon Duchesne, a mathematician, quote, "In math, we have an interesting relationship to stuff. If you can conceive of something and create rules for handling it, then it exists. And then she proceeds to talk about how does infinity fill into all that, and that how mathematicians have created rules that handle it. But then infinity one-ups them and shows them that they don't know how to handle infinity, right? But this pride that comes in the ability that, okay, sure, the universe might be vast, but we're so smart, we've figured everything out. We can create rules to handle everything and anything, including increasingly large populations, right? This is where a lot of religious people have fear. The rules that non-religious people are creating to handle large populations as they wish to push their vision, right? And this gets back to, communism and other isms in which thinkers have said, there's a better way. There's a better way. Karl Marx and Lenin were not trying to create the monstrosity of Stalin or Pol Pot, right? Or various Chinese leaders, Mao, whoever. They were not trying to create those Frankensteins, but they were coming up with new rules of how to deal with stuff, and in this case, populations, right? The theories of Karl Marx were specifically intended. How do we move populations from one way to another? How do we cause revolution to restructure society towards this better vision?
Right. His ditches were just a lot deeper.
Yeah, big enough to bury millions of people in.
Yeah, I mean, I view that as specifically the Marxist, and it's hard because I've spent a lot of time hanging out, if you will, with academic types, and I mean, I'm an outcast really in that group, but it comes from
welcome to the club, said Groucho Marx.
Yeah,
not Carl.
Yeah,
right.
Said Groucho. Yeah,
yeah.
But I'm an outcast in there, and I try and understand it. And I remember one particular group that I was participating in, and I guess like kind of an icon in circles. And I just kind of asked him. I thought, why does it have to be labeled like a derivative of Marx? Like what? Why is there a tradition that has to follow with such a horrific? And there's no answer to it. It's almost like it's the epitome of what Jafar talks about. It's like you belong to this club, and you are you're forming like an outcast Marxist sort of collective group of like revolutionary thinkers. And when you do that from an intellectual standpoint, it's like it's an interesting club to belong to, but it feels very, to me, it feels very subtly coercive, and I love this word of perversion. It's like it's perverse to its core. It's just not a good representation of what societies are and how they function. What Marx was really trying to do, I think there was a time period where maybe it was Newton, I think. It's undeniable what Newton brought the world in terms of his Mathematica, right? Being able to predict things and revolutionize physics, for example, okay? But when someone says, hey, that's a great idea, I think I can do that to describe social networks and people in populations. That was Marx in the back room saying, hey, Newton had a great idea. I'm going to do this. And you go, wait a minute. That is much more complex and I just think that it's not something to follow until you have, if your end goal is to have something of production, of proof that exists, like a Newtonian proof for society, then have the proof, be able to predict it, right, in some other ways, and don't make it ideological. But that's not the case.
It's become like it's like they don't have the proof, but they think they'll get it if they keep trying, and then they keep modifying and trying and trying. If there's enough iterations of the experiment, then eventually they'll get there to the utopia.
Sure, but I agree with you. But I think also the issue is in this chemist's experience, human beings are the particles of the experiment. So you have to get all the particles to behave in a similar way, right? And that's what Marx was doing, getting all the particles in the petri dish to behave in a similar way, to move in the same direction.
Forcibly so, right? And subdued, and
Right.
killing off the ones that don't comply. And
that was Stalin. I don't know that Marx.
No, right. But
right.
Still, if there's
right.
something that, and that's where the Marxist population is going to say, well, I'm not quoting it right, and this, it just,
right.
Look, it's how do you apply that? And to me, it's something that, it's just fundamentally the description of a sociology is just, it's incomplete. And so here I am talking about somebody else like E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book called Sociobiology. Okay. And by his own admission, he's saying this is like, for us to understand how we exist in the world, how we as populations exist and function in the world, there's such a gap in our knowledge, right? And I want to talk about nothing metaphysical. I want to talk only about biology and ecosystems. There is so much work to be done with a handful of soil and the living ecosystem that exists right beneath our feet for us to even begin to know how we function in this biosphere. So if we want to understand how we exist in this world from a biological standpoint and from a scientific standpoint, we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And I think we would do our societies a great service by maintaining that humility. So moving from a hubris state to a state of humility for a very long time, because it's going to be, there's a lot that we don't know. And that's why I get, well, maybe to add some flavor and some humility to my rantings that maybe some of the listeners have seen about climate change and biodiversity collapse. This may be a mad rush to mediate or fix biodiversity when we don't quite know how to do it. Similar kind of thing, right? So with that wisdom comes, I think, a strong understanding and necessity, biological imperative, to make sure that we're not allowing history to repeat itself in such a huge leap from one ditch to another. I mean, let's just kind of hop from one to the other. Keep it manageable, and allow our friends to pull us back from the other one. Not, not a I don't know, an excavator and in a mass grave or something like this. It's like too much. that changes humanity, and so much to the negative. I think so much to the negative.
Well said, Daniel.
Can I finish with something
Yes.
that the listeners might like? I want to talk about my fantasy about the Pope. And that pause was intentional there, because I think
the floor is yours.
Daniel's fantasy about the Pope. Okay, I've got this reoccurring dream, and it's just a fantasy, because I've never actually had the dream in a like a semi-wakeful state. But I think to myself, wouldn't it be amazing if he pride goeth before destruction, and as a haughty spirit before a fall.
It's a belated validation of things we were saying a while ago. It is not a warning to you before you start talking about the Pope.
About the Pope and my fantasy, my fantasy of the Pope. But
thank you.
I imagine that he stands up and he says, "Look, I'm going to crumble. I'm going to bring down to the church, and I'm going to disintegrate it, and we're going to all, like the value of that." It was like the last Pope. And I would say, I think that would be amazing. That whole financial structure, the whole need to reconcile, the whole all the controversies. That church can stand that idea of God, and the what makes it strong is not the Catholic Church per se, and focusing on probably that spirit that unites us, and dissolving the financial and corporate enterprise. I don't know if it's right.
Bring down a building that big, Patagonia. There might be a lot of collateral damage.
Probably, but that's why it's kind of this like living little fantasy in my head to think, what kind of Pope would that be? Right. And especially if he took that leadership role and said, look, it's about time that it's not a move to anything secular. It's actually, to me, it would be a very liberating and freeing universal declaration of freedom for Christianity.
Give me 1 minute and I'll pull up the scripture. Neither endorsing or stipulating that what you're saying is accurate, but I'm going to share a verse. Go ahead.
Don't you think, Daniel, that would you'd have, I don't know how many millions of people would just suddenly be lost, even if it's theoretically for the better, but then suddenly you have millions and millions of people that are like, what do I do now?
No, but he'd have to instill the confidence that you're still following him. Like, you're still following the church. Faith is stronger than ever, right? I mean, this
just
is
wipe out the corruption. Is that what you're saying?
Just take make those funds part of, I don't know, like just eliminate the corporate mass that exists behind that structure. I mean, I don't know if it's something that Wade's going to share, but
can you see what I'm sharing here?
Yeah,
from Revelation chapter 21. Go ahead, read it, Daniel. See if this is in alignment with your dream.
All things made new. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. Yeah, I mean,
In this, there's no pope, is my point.
I
The,
think
the pope in this scenario, the pope would have to give way for this to happen. And I'm not targeting the Catholic Church or the Pope specifically. I'm talking about any religious leader. I'm talking about myself when I resigned from the ministry.
right. I would say, like, and this is just an intuition, but to me, the leadership of the Pope would he would still remain a leader, but probably do something. It would feel much more grassroots. It would feel much more like an eye to eye level um, with the people, and he would actually inspire more confidence as a leader, I think, to do that.
Well, to perhaps others who were not already his followers, and to some of his followers. But speaking from experience with, again, the scenario that I described earlier and the schism of the worldwide Church of God into two denominations, which then further splintered and dwindled, um, you would lose many of the followers,
Mm.
at least in terms of the organized religion.
You might even
Which,
see an assassination, and then the new pope gets
right?
pushed in place.
Well, there you go. Right,
like he was senile, or this
right,
is
right, right. Yeah,
yeah.
like like PayPal's recent announcement that "Oops, our new policy was not really a policy." So, couldn't resist. Don't know if you heard about that one.
No.
Oh, PayPal issued an announcement that they were going to be confiscating your money if you were involved in misinformation.
Oh, wonderful.
And and there was a hue
That
and a
was
cry, which was reported to have been from the right, but there was a hue and a cry, and PayPal informed everybody that they had misinformed everybody about their misinformation policy. It does not get any more ironic than
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Have you
And
heard
so
about
and so
the
those who were concerned, you can still buy and sell through PayPal for the moment. And yes, I am referring to those passages in Revelation about people preventing you from buying and selling. And with that, um, we've, as REM said when they sang about losing their religion, "Oh no, I've said too much. I haven't said enough." I don't know if that's a fitting note to end on, but after all, you're the one who brought up your dream about the the Pope ending the Catholic Church. So, on that lighthearted note, Daniel, Jafar, any other words of wisdom, thoughts, and comments before we end this last episode with a tear about Daniel not being here next time, and with notice to all those viewers who are right now liking and subscribing and sharing this with their friends that we will have new interesting guests next week for you to try to fill the wonderful shoes, Daniel, that you've been bringing to this show for many episodes now.
Well, thanks, Wade, and thanks, Jafar. I really, I want to assure the listeners that it's not quite the sad affair that Wade is saying. I'm still really going to be involved, and I imagine maybe coming back for another appearance at some point. But
You will absolutely be welcome.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
hopefully we
yeah,
get to hang out in person sometimes. My family out in Seattle, so it'd be fun to
oh
talk more.
yeah, yeah. We'll attend a Fransson farm event.
Well, we are having here on our property the Fall Harvest Challenge. We had a camp that we did this summer. I may show the video here sometime. The camp had no name. It's since been given the name the Hillcrest Orchard Camp, because one of the things the campers did was plant cherry trees and apple trees. And we're having a fall harvest challenge, which will be quite fun here coming up in a few weeks. So we do interesting things here on this property as well. Very practical. AM Sterling, thank you so much. A vote of
Thanks, A.M.
confidence to
Sterling.
you, Daniel.
Yeah.
And again, any last thoughts, Jafar, before we tearfully, to a degree, end this? All right. Thank you once again. Please do tune in next week, and I guarantee you, you will not be disappointed, other than the fact that Daniel won't be here, which is a disappointment. But really, really, one last time, thank you so much for all your contributions, and I know the listeners will look forward to you coming back again soon.
Thanks, Wade. Thanks, Jafar.
Yep. Take care.